What's good, YouTube? It's me, Bush, back in the next video. We just woke up from a coma after a couple of years, and Edison format is all the rage. That's right, goal control is not a thing anymore. Edison is a new Flava Flav. So I want to make this quick video to talk about a couple of important tips that you should know for the format after having played a couple of games, and also having played, all the way back then. So the first tip, without further ado, is playing through powerful one-of trap cards. Now, if you guys know about this format, it's an older format where there were a lot of staples that were all at one, and playing around the traps are really important. When your opponent sets a trap, playing into a certain powerful trap can literally mean that you lose the game on the spot. So first and foremost, say we have a monster on the board, we definitely want to first consider one of the most explosive trap cards in the format, and that's actually Torrential Tribute. This is a card that just is relentless. If you summon a monster into this card, you just lose your entire board, so it's very important. So the easiest way to play around Torrential Tribute is obviously not committing any extra monsters on the board. We can just deal with what board we have and continue to poke at them. If we have something like a Zombie Master in this case, just keep attacking. They don't have anything on the board, which means that we're kind of ahead right now. We're threatening the offense, right? So just attacking here will make sure that they're not able to activate Torrential Tribute, and if they're desperate, when their life points are really low, then they have to actually waste a monster by summoning into their own Torrential Tribute. Alternatively, if you have something that is called basically a floater in old man's Yu-Gi-Oh terms, which means that a card that can replace itself when it's sent from the field to graveyard, then there's definitely an excuse to commit to the board. For example, we have something like a Sangin or a Goblin Zombie, we can definitely normal summon that to the board, and then if Torrential Tribute happens, we lose both our monsters, but we get the effect of Sangin to replace itself, so it doesn't really matter. It's still 1-for-1 trade, right? The key thing that you guys have to know about the older formats is that 1-for-1 advantage was a huge thing. The game was a lot of back and forth, and getting a +1 on your opponent often meant that you were very far ahead in the game, and getting +2, plus at the end of the game state, your opponents are whittled down, and you probably win because you have more cards than them. So nowadays, you obviously set like 5 off rescue aids, but it's a lot different of a game. So it's just up to you to consider, if you want to actually mount the offense, and there might be a reason to summon like a Sangin or something, and you don't actually get punished as hard in Torrential Tribute. So the next powerful, high-impact one-of trap card that you definitely have to play around Edison is none other than one of Yugi's signature cards in the anime, and that's actually Mirror Force. Yep, this is a very powerful board wipe in the olden days, and it was at 1 for the longest time, including in this format, but was also banned for some duration of time. Yep, battle traps were extremely good back then, guys. So this would wipe your entire board if you just attacked directly into it, right? If we attacked it with 2 monsters, we just get a 2-for-1 trade that's in our opponent's favor, so it's not great. So it kind of applies similar to Torrential Tribute. You can obviously play around this easily by tilting monsters that you don't want to get affected by Mirror Force in defense mode, right? And then this way, it's just 1-for-1 trade. Alternatively, though, just like Torrential Tribute, if you have floaters, you could risk swinging into the Mirror Force, because this means we're still going to be able to use the effect of our floater in the graveyard, meaning that it's a 1-for-1 trade. They get rid of the Zombie Master, but we get the effect of Sangin to search, so effectively it's just a 1-for-1 free trade there. So just playing around this card for sure, and it's really nice once these cards are in the graveyard, you can just play with no fear. You don't really have to play around them anymore, so just keeping a tab on if this card has been activated, either of these cards, is really important. And then the last really powerful high impact trap one-of that you have to play around is none other than Solemn Judgment. Yep, this card was at 1 back in the olden days, and it was extremely high impact if you played directly into it. Now, this can actually negate summons, which is oftentimes what it can be used for in Edison in terms of disruption. So if you're wasting your monsters 2 bodies to go into a powerful Synchro monster and directly play into the Solemn Judgment, then that could mean that you effectively lose the game, because you're losing your summons, you're losing your monsters, and you get a 2-for-1 trade that's in your opponent's favor. So definitely make sure that you account for Solemn Judgment. If there's a trap card that's set on the field for a long period of time, and especially if your opponent has been thinking for a long period of time in response to basically everything that you do, there's a chance that they're telegraphing they have Solemn Judgment, so just be aware of that and the fact that it might be a card in their back row. Another really easy way to read Solemn Judgment is when they go set more than 2 cards to their back row, because obviously Heavy Storm exists in this format, so having a counter to Heavy Storm means that they're going to be setting multiple back row without any fears. And then next, talking about 2 other traps that are not one-ofs but are very common in this format. First and foremost, Bottomless Trap Hole. This is a card that says when your opponent summons a monster with 1500 or more attack, destroy it and banish it. So it's obviously quite easy to play around this card, but you're not going to have the chance every time. But say we have this hand with Zombie Master and Sangin, you could obviously summon the Zombie Master and get banished by the Bottomless Trap Hole, or alternatively, we could summon a monster with 1500 or less attack like Sangin and survive the Bottomless Trap Hole. And the last trap card that's very common actually is Dimensional Prison. This is a card that's very, very effective in this format, especially because it's generic removal for any sort of monster, right? There are a lot of different monsters in the game, like synchro monsters or effect monsters. This effectively deals with everything as long as they attack. Now, that condition is obviously fulfilled by you when you go to attack, so you can choose not to attack, especially if you're attacking with something like a Sangan or potentially something like a Stardust Dragon that gets heavily punished by investing your resources in that summon and then getting hit by the Dimensional Prison, right? So being very, very careful and selective when to attack and with what monsters to attack is very, very important, because this card is effectively in every deck, I think, right now as the metagame is evolving. Okay, so the next Edison tip for you guys is when to attack into a blank board, because obviously we know that GORZ, the Emissary of Darkness, is a thing in this format, and it's very, very powerful, especially if we go ahead and attack recklessly into a blank board, and then boom, all of a sudden our opponent has not only a 2700 beater, but also a token that matches the attack of the actual monster that attacked, which is equally as bad, right? It's a lot of pressure that just like, it's a very, very high momentum swing card, and you definitely don't want to attack into this. Now, the nice thing about this is obviously you can choose when to attack into a blank board. From here, we could just not attack actually and just pass, right? You don't necessarily have to do the damage. This older format a lot of times is a lot of tempo based back and forth, so damage isn't nearly as important as actually securing card advantage and resources. Now, another thing you could do is attack when you have defense against GORZ. For example, here we have Mirror Force and Torrential. So if you think that you have a way to actually deal with GORZ, you can definitely set the Mirror Force afterwards, and then that GORZ will not be as bad because we kind of have a way to deal with it in the worst case scenario on the chance that they do have it. So then in that case, you could definitely take the chance to have GORZ. But again, there are obviously cards like Heavy Storm, MST that can punish cards like this. They can obviously play very clever and just try to crash the token while keeping their GORZ as well, which could kind of punish you technically. So it really depends on what your hand is, but I would definitely encourage you guys to resist the urge to attack if you have no way to deal with GORZ, because it's a very, very harsh gamble if you do end up losing it. The next tip involves this very, very powerful trap card called Trap DUSTSHOOT. This effectively allows you to see your opponent's hand, shuffle back at a monster, but more importantly, you get all the information on what they have in their hand, and then you know what to play around and what to play into, right? So it's very, very powerful. But I see a lot of players actually shotgunning this directly on their opponent's draw phase, and that's not necessarily always the correct move. Now, half the time it is, but there are other times where you can actually keep this card set and potentially bait out a removal, so they waste a resource against it, and you can immediately chain the Trap DUSTSHOOT. So if they go like, you just go pass, draw standby main is good, and they might go something like, hey, I'm going to MST that card and try to chip in some damage with Spirit Reaper or anything that we might have, or try to go for OTK, which is where you can immediately chain the Trap DUSTSHOOT, meaning you're getting free value out of the MST. I don't recommend this all the time, because they could actually just punish you if they don't actually have MST or they don't go for it and just set a monster. And then if you Trap DUSTSHOOT here, you kind of lose that monster being shuffled back as well as what that monster possibly is. But a lot of times it could be worth it to take the risk. Alternatively, you could also set it with another trap card. So committing 2 cards to the table means that your opponent might actually think, oh, hey, I'm just going to get a free Heavy Storm for a +1 here. But really, we have a Trap DUSTSHOOT set, meaning that Heavy Storm has been wasted as a 1-for-1. It's basically become an MST instead of Heavy Storm, which is one of the most powerful cards in the game, right? So just being clever with your Trap DUSTSHOOT. You don't always have to shotgun this card immediately, even though it is the type of card that you want to shotgun. There are ways to possibly mind game your opponent and get some intrinsic resources and value out of it. Next tip for you guys is to play around this very, very powerful, arguably the most powerful card in the entire format, and that's actually Brain Control, which says pay 800 life points, select one face-up monster your opponent controls, and take control of it. Obviously, this is pre-errata, meaning that they could take control of any face-up monster until the end of the turn and basically do whatever the heck they want with it. Now, there is a steep cost for this, so you have to pay 800 life points, so keeping a tab on your opponent's life points is super, super important. Like in this board state, we can obviously swing, with all our monsters, but alternatively, we could just go ahead and resurrect the Plague Spreader Zombie just to ensure that we get that extra bit of damage on the table, which guarantees that our opponent is not going to be able to use Brain Control, right? Because if we haven't seen this card hit the graveyard yet, that means it's somewhere in the game, somewhere in their deck or hand. So we want to chip as much damage as possible. So in this case, us dealing 5,400 damage instead of the actual previous damage that we had, leaving them at less than 800 life points, meaning they're not going to be able to use Brain Control. Even though it's not game, we're kind of overextending, but we're making sure that they're not using one of the only cards that they could effectively use to swing back the game in their momentum and potentially win just off of this one card. Because this card is absolutely crazy. You can take the monster, which is a removal as is, and then they contribute it or synchro off with it or do whatever the heck they want with that monster. So definitely always to turn this card off in terms of stopping their life points and making it as low as possible is very, very significant. Anytime you have a chance to swing so they have less than 800, definitely go for it and do it. And then the last tip that I have for you guys today is to not set all of your cards. I see a lot of beginner players make this mistake. For example, if they have multiple copies of a trap like the double D prison, they might go ahead and set double D prison thinking, hey, I'm playing around MST. Unfortunately, this is a huge liability to Heavy Storm. So losing both of your cards off the Heavy Storm means that you could potentially lose a game on the spot when you don't have any removal for your opponent's signature monster. Now, instead, we could just set the one-dimensional prison, meaning if our opponent Heavy Storms, well, the chances of them OTKing are very slim. In this format, there are very rarely OTKs unless your opponent absolutely opens the stones, so it doesn't really matter. We still have the D prison for the consecutive turn to still defend us. Now, you could make an argument, you're saying, hey, what if they have MST? They're just going to blow the D prison and then continue playing, but that doesn't really matter. It doesn't mean that we're going to lose the game. It's a 1-for-1. What really would hurt is when they do resolve the Heavy Storm for 2 of our cards, meaning we actually get a -1 advantage on that trade, right? So definitely don't set all of your cards, guys, unless you absolutely have to, or unless you have floaters. Like we previously talked about Trap DUSTSHOOT being one of the floater cards that you could set alongside another card. So if we get a Heavy Storm, it's still 1-for-1 trade. You could also do this with other cards like Jar of Greed or Legacy of Yatagarasu, which both replace themselves, so you're not losing any intrinsic value from your opponent using something like Heavy Storm, right? So yeah, those are all the tips that I actually had for you guys in terms of Edison. Do you have any tips for the format for the rest of the players? Let us know in the comments below. Other than that, definitely subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks for tuning in.